The conquest of the Americas and the transatlantic slave trade were not just about wealth and power. They were a Christian jihad. Spain and Portugal, backed by the Catholic Church, saw themselves as warriors of God, expanding Christendom by force. Much like the Islamic jihads of earlier centuries, this was a holy war, but one waged through conquest, slavery, and colonization. With papal decrees blessing their campaigns, they seized lands, enslaved entire populations, and justified it all in the name of faith. The doctrine of discovery became their weapon, and the world would never be the same. To understand the true nature of this global conquest, we must go back to where it all began.
We ask and require you to acknowledge the Church as the ruler and superior of the whole world and the high priest called the Pope, and in his name the King and Queen of Spain as lords of this land. If you do so, you will do well, and we shall receive you in love and charity and leave you your lands free. But if you do not, or delay in doing so, we shall make war against you in all ways we can, and shall take you and your wives and children and make slaves of them, and we shall do you all the harm and damage we can as to vassals who do not obey, and we protest that the deaths and losses that shall come from this will be your fault and not that of their highnesses nor ours.
The conquest of the Americas was more than a series of battles. It was a collision of civilizations. The Spanish, vastly outnumbered, faced mighty indigenous empires, but they did not fight alone. They turned rivals against each other, exploited weaknesses, and, when the dust settled, their allies realized they had been betrayed. Before the Spanish arrived, the Americas were home to advanced civilizations. The Aztec and Inca empires ruled through military dominance and vast networks of alliances. Yet their power would not be enough to stop an enemy who fought differently. The Aztecs had a prophecy that the god Quetzalcoatl would return in the year 1 Reed, 1519. When Cortés arrived, Moctezuma hesitated, an uncertainty that would cost him his empire.
If he believes we are gods, we will let him. Time is on our side.
With only 500 men, Cortés could not defeat 200,000 Aztec warriors alone. But he didn't have to. The Tlaxcalans, long oppressed by the Aztecs, saw the Spanish as liberators. What they did not realize was that they were simply replacing one ruler with another. In 1532, Francisco Pizarro arrived in the Andes. Unlike the Aztecs, the Inca Empire was already weakened, torn apart by civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. Pizarro knew that this division was his greatest advantage. Unlike Moctezuma, Atahualpa did not believe the Spanish were divine, but he underestimated their strategy. The Inca had never faced gunpowder, cavalry, or steel weapons before. As thousands of Inca warriors stood in formation, Pizarro and his 168 soldiers prepared their ambush. Atahualpa, confident in his numbers, had no idea what was coming. Cannons tore through the Incan ranks, muskets picked off warriors from a distance, and cavalry trampled the rest. The battle was over before it had begun. Atahualpa was captured, and the Spanish took control of the empire. Though Atahualpa was executed, the Inca resistance continued for decades. It was not until 1572, when the last stronghold of Vilcabamba fell, that the Inca Empire was fully conquered. In 1492, Christopher Columbus's journey set in motion a new era, one that would see Spain lay claim to vast lands across the Americas. In the decades that followed, Spanish conquistadors dismantled powerful empires, from the Aztecs in Mexico to the Incas in the Andes. These civilizations, known for their grand cities, sophisticated technologies, and rich cultures, crumbled under the weight of conquest. Before the rise of the plantation economy, Spain relied on an older system of wealth extraction, the tribute system, a model rooted in medieval Europe and the Islamic world. Rather than immediately reshaping their colonies into large-scale agricultural enterprises, the Spanish imposed a system where indigenous populations were forced to pay tribute in the form of gold, silver, food, textiles, and labor. Many empires before them, including the Moors, Ottomans, and Mongols, had used tribute to extract wealth from conquered lands. To govern their vast new territories, Spain established 4 viceroyalties. These administrative divisions were designed to extract wealth from the colonies and funnel it back to Spain. Under the encomienda system, Spanish settlers, called encomenderos, were granted control over indigenous villages. Though not technically enslaved, indigenous people were forced to work, pay tribute, and provide resources to their Spanish overlords in exchange for so-called protection and religious instruction. This system allowed Spanish settlers to extract labor without performing any themselves. In practice, it was slavery by another name, where indigenous people were bound to the land and had no choice but to obey. A brutal institution that granted Spanish settlers control over entire indigenous communities. Forced into relentless labor in mines, fields, and construction projects, indigenous people paid the ultimate price, not just in wealth but in blood. But the tribute system had a flaw. It depended on a stable, large indigenous population, and the Spanish conquest had shattered that stability. War, disease, and social collapse decimated indigenous communities. As populations plummeted, the Spanish faced a crisis. How could they maintain their wealth extraction if the labor force was vanishing? In half a century, the indigenous population of the Americas plummeted from an estimated 60 million to just 6 million. Entire villages were wiped out so quickly that there weren't enough survivors left to bury the dead. Some bodies were left in abandoned cities, while others were thrown into rivers or buried in mass graves. European explorers later found skeletal remains in empty settlements, remnants of civilizations that had collapsed before they even arrived. But as the indigenous population declined, Spain turned to another source of labor: enslaved Africans. While the Caribbean became the primary destination for enslaved Africans, the mainland colonies also relied on their labor. In places like Mexico, Peru, and Colombia, enslaved Africans worked in mines, on plantations, and in cities. Their lives were marked by unimaginable hardship. The conditions were brutal. Enslaved Africans in mines faced cave-ins, toxic fumes, and backbreaking labor. On plantations, they worked long hours under the scorching sun, often with little food or rest. In cities, they were used as domestic servants, artisans, and laborers. Life expectancy was shockingly low. Many did not survive more than a few years after arrival. Spanish America was governed by a rigid social hierarchy known as the casta system. At the top were the Spanish-born elites, followed by criollos, American-born Spaniards, mestizos, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans at the bottom. This system reinforced racial and social divisions, ensuring that power and privilege remained in the hands of a few. Yet, even in the face of unimaginable suffering, enslaved Africans resisted. They rebelled, escaped to form maroon communities, and preserved their cultural traditions. Today, their legacy lives on in the vibrant Afro-descendant communities of Latin America. This transition from the tribute system to the plantation economy was not immediate, but over time. As the encomienda system weakened and indigenous resistance mounted, Spain and Portugal fully embraced the African slave trade as their primary means of labor exploitation. It was no longer just about extracting wealth from existing societies. It was about creating entire economies built on human bondage. While Spain built its empire on the forced labor of indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans, its neighbor Portugal took a different approach. Portugal would become the first European power to dominate the transatlantic slave trade, shipping millions of Africans across the ocean to fuel its growing empire. The Portuguese established trading posts along the West African coast as early as the 1440s. But by the 1500s, these coastal outposts had become centers of the transatlantic slave trade, supplying enslaved Africans not just to Portugal's own colonies, but to the entire European world. While Spain controlled vast territories in the Americas, it lacked the infrastructure to source enslaved labor directly from Africa. Instead, it turned to Portugal, which held the Asiento de Negros, a contract granting them the exclusive right to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. Through this system, Portuguese traders funneled hundreds of thousands of captives into Hispaniola, Cuba, Mexico, and Peru, ensuring that Spain's mines and sugar plantations had a constant supply of labor. As Portugal expanded its presence in West Africa, a new social class emerged, the mulattoes, the mixed-race descendants of Portuguese men and African women. Unlike in other European colonies, where racial mixing was discouraged, the Portuguese integrated these communities into colonial society. Over time, some mulattoes became interpreters, traders, and local officials. By the 1500s, Portugal had turned Africa into a key supplier of enslaved labor for the Americas. Portuguese traders established direct control over the trade, managing every aspect, from capturing and branding captives to shipping them across the Atlantic. The Portuguese crown controlled major slave trading ports in Angola and Mozambique, ensuring a steady flow of forced labor to its colonies. Unlike later European powers that relied on chartered companies, Portugal ran its slave trade as a state-backed enterprise. By the time Portugal's slave trade ended, it had transported nearly 6 million Africans across the Atlantic, more than any other European nation. The vast majority, around 4.9 million, were sent to Brazil, shaping its demographics, economy, and culture. Another 800,000 to 1 million were sent to Spanish America, while smaller numbers were trafficked to Portugal's Atlantic islands, India, and the Indian Ocean colonies. At the dawn of the Age of Exploration, Spain and Portugal stood unrivaled. Backed by the Catholic Church, these two Iberian powers justified their expansion and the enslavement of millions through religion, conquest, and economic necessity. The papal bulls of the 15th century, including Dom Diversas, 1452, and Romanus Pontifex, 1455, granted Spain and Portugal the right to claim new lands and enslaved non-Christians under the banner of spreading Catholicism. To the ruling monarchs, slavery was not just about wealth, it was a divine mission. Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering the hidden truths of history. Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and stay tuned for more deep dives into the past. See you in the next video.
Banna banna, sango sango, simba simba, tanda tanda.